All right, so let's finish up the second part of chapter 23, all right, and look at the physical properties of our metals. So, a lot of this you probably are going to remember from first year chem, right? Metals conduct heat, they conduct electricity well, they're malleable, they're ductile, all right, they can be drawn into a wire. And now, hopefully, that we've looked at unit cells, you understand that the atoms are packed really tight together, but they can slip past each other, okay? Because they can move and have some flexibility, the metals aren't as brittle as other solids. Now, when we look at metals, especially like the transition metals, we notice that they don't have enough electrons in their valence shell in order to bond, in accordance with the octet rule. So in order to explain how they are bonding, we use something called the electron C model. And when we think about this, it's just like it sounds, right? You have a bunch of these cations, and they are suspended in a sea of valence electrons. The valence electrons don't belong to any specific cation. They can move from place to place, which is actually what gives it its electrical conductivity, right? When you hook it to opposite ends of a battery, the electrons can flow. Now, the attraction of the positive to negative, right, cation to electron, does keep the electrons mostly bound uh, to the metal itself. But again, it's just not so tight as to impede flow. Now, this does explain conductivity of electricity. It also explains conductivity of heat because since the electrons can move freely, they are able to impart kinetic energy from point A to point B really well. And so, excuse me, since kinetic energy and heat go hand in hand, having these electrons able to move, hither and yon without much in the way allows heat to move through the metal very, very rapidly. Now, because the metals are packed close together and bonded to the cations around them, you can deform the metal, right, just by pressing the cations into a different arrangement, right? Now, that does involve some movement of electrons as well, but that's not really a huge concern. Unfortunately, it doesn't explain all um, of the characteristics that we see in metals, especially when we look at how those same characteristics line up in nonmetals. So if you were looking at the nonmetals, right, we would expect that the boiling point would increase, say, with increasing number of electrons. That's not what we see when we look at the boiling points of the transition metals. We actually see that in the middle of the transition metal block, you have a peak, right? But the electrons are increasing all the way across. So electrons are increasing, and we would expect the actual line to look like that, but it doesn't. And so we have to be able to explain that too, right? We want to be able to explain all of those um, characteristics. And in order to do that, we have to go back and think about the molecular orbital theories again. And we know that with molecular orbital theory, when atomic orbitals overlap, it creates these hybridized molecular orbitals. Well, with the S and P block being the only thing involved, you get really distinct orbitals that aren't very close together. They're discrete entities, okay? And when you come to the D block, though, the D block, the wave function kind of it falls off sooner, okay, as you get away from the nucleus. So the D block orbitals have a tendency to overlap, and you end up with these molecular orbitals that are less like orbitals and more like bands, okay? And so as those bands fill up, they reach a point where the bonding bands at the bottom and the anti-bonding bands at the top start to interact with each other. So what we see is when you get about halfway through the molecular orbital, the reservoir is full right there. And so there is our strongest, bonding set where it's going to affect our boiling point and stuff. As you keep going, right, and you're adding more electrons, you're starting to get into these anti-bonding bands, and the antibonding bands repel, right? They weaken some of those influences of those extra valence electrons, and so our boiling point kind of falls off. All right, we see that with the boiling point. We see it with the melting point. Actually, here's the boiling point. Sorry, this is the boiling point. This is the melting point. Okay, and we see that is a good explanation for a lot of these things that peak in the middle of our transition row, right, or in the middle of our metals, rather. Now, alloys, something we've already talked a little bit about, can actually mix up some of these characteristics. We really like alloys. Alloys are good things. They allow human beings to kind of tailor make a metal for a specific purpose. Remember that there are two kinds of alloys, okay? They are solutions, so to speak, where the components are dispersed uniformly throughout your compound. You can have substitutional alloys, where specific metals are just replaced, and you can have interstitial alloys. An interstitial alloy is here on the right, where you can see that we've fit these components into the little windows. They're much smaller, so we have a we'll say a size disparity. All right, but if you have comparable size, then you're probably going to be a substitutional alloy. So if your elements that you're substituting in are about the same size, that's comparable. That's going to be a substitutional alloy. If there's a big size disparity, you're going to end up with the interstitial alloy. Now, we have already talked about the unit cells. Keep in mind that when you start fitting those things into the windows, right, what you're actually doing is maybe making a face-centered cubic lattice instead of a body-centered cubic lattice, or maybe instead of a primitive cubic lattice, right? So it's going to adjust the chemical, it's going to adjust the structure of that crystal as you add those other elements to make your alloy. A great example is cobalt samarium, which is what they use in headsets and speakers, which is what I have on my head. Now, our transition metals, great important metals, probably the most important metals to human civilization are the transition metals. They are the D block, right? You probably already know that. And a lot of their properties are really interesting, right? They suggest some isolated atoms at some points. They also suggest bulk behavior at other points. They're kind of interesting in that respect. Now, the atomic radii or trends are pretty similar across the entire series. Okay, we see that they are, trending. They follow these same trends, right? We have down, up, down, up, down, up, right, just like that. And the effective nuclear charge that we see does increase across the row. You also end up with more non-bonding electrons across the row, and they are going to be the thing that pushes the radius to increase. Now, another thing that we know about the transition metals is the fact that they have multiple oxidation states. Now, this is interesting, and if you end up taking higher level chemistry, you'll look at this a little bit closer. But as you look at the D block, we'll just say the 3D block, right? So here's 3D. Here is 4S. So we know coming in that most of these guys are going to have the 4S valence shell is going to be full. And then as you start to add your electrons, you get over to manganese, you've got 5, all right, of these unpaired electrons. Now, most of these guys, with the exception of scandium, can have a +2 oxidation state. And that's because if we lose these two, we end up with a +2 spot. If you want to get oxidation numbers that are greater than +2, you have to start losing D electrons in addition to those S electrons. So for manganese, which can be +7, they would have to lose all of these, right? So here would be +3, +4, +5, +6. And if you lose that one, you get +7. Now, once you get to manganese, you get halfway through, you would start to get the second pair. And when you have paired electrons, they actually don't want to be lost, right? That's harder for them to lose. And so iron doesn't get to +7, it gets to +6. Cobalt actually drops all the way down and will only go to +3. Okay, so it'll only end up losing one of those. And that is something that you would look at in more detail if you took something like, say, grad level inorganic chemistry. It is an interesting topic of discussion. And, just as a side note, usually you're only going to get something like +7 if they're bonded to one of the really electronegative nonmetals. So if you end up taking your discovery journey in the field of chemistry further, then you may see some of that in higher level chem. It's interesting stuff. Now, another side effect, right, of these multiple oxidation states is, or another observation we can make about them, is it does result in different colored compounds. Remember, color and electrons and electron configurations are intimately correlated, so it does make sense that we see some different colors there. Now, the last part of the chapter mainly deals with magnetism, and magnetism is a pretty important factor because by measuring something's magnetism, you can actually glean some information about the electrons that are present and the way that they are organized. So a lot of metals do have significant magnetic properties. There are diamagnetic elements, in which case all of your spins are paired, and the slideshow says there's no net magnetic movement. That's not entirely true. If it's diamagnetic, then it will have a very subtle response. It will be pulled into a magnetic field. But for the overall observation, we just say it doesn't really have a magnetic moment. Now, in this instance, think about this as each electron is like these two guys cancel each other out. They cancel each other out. And so there is no net spin that can respond to our magnetic moment. If we have paramagnetic atoms, then in paramagnetic atoms, the magnetic fields of certain components are randomly arranged and they are unaffected by their neighbors. This is really important. This is the difference between paramagnetism and ferromagnetism. And so paramagnetism, since those spins of the electrons are not affected, they will line up when you put it into a magnetic field and you will see some magnetic behavior. Now, paramagnetism is not the magnet that we all think of. Ferromagnets are the magnets you probably think of when you think of a magnet. And in ferromagnetism, the unpaired electrons are affected by the spins from electrons on their neighbors, okay? And so that's the difference. In paramagnetism, they're unaffected by their neighbors, and in ferromagnetism, the spins are affected by their neighbors. Now, when you add an external magnetic field, or when you apply an external magnetic field to a ferromagnet, it will maintain that magnetic moment where all of the spins remain aligned in one direction, right? If we look back at the previous slide, they weren't lined up, but now once we've added that that magnetic field, they do line up, and that's a permanent magnet. Now, the remainder of these slides go with section 8 in the textbook. Section 8 takes the trends that we looked at in the first couple parts of these of the chapter, and they just apply it to chromium, iron, and copper so that you can see some trends. I'm not going to go through this as far as the slides are concerned because it would literally just be like me reading out of the textbook. It's nothing there's nothing in the textbook that's not explained. So it does look at chromium. It looks at its oxidations, all right? It looks at iron and the oxidation state it exists at, right? And it looks at nickel, I believe, or copper is the last one, copper, and it looks at its oxidation states and some of its behaviors. So give section 8 a read for that. You can skim it, all right? That would be a good section to skim to finish this chapter off, all right? If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll be glad to give you guys a hand.